Okay, let's make some snares in Serum. Okay, so by popular request, we're doing snares in Serum. Now this is pretty straightforward. You just need a few LFOs acting as envelopes and some really basic shapes out of Serum. And then it really comes down to post-processing to make it something really exciting and unique. So we're here in Snare Anatomy Park, and we're going to have a look at this snare that I made earlier. Now, I made this snare using the same process I'm going to follow to show you later. It came straight out of Serum, and then it's had a little bit of processing applied afterwards. Here's what it sounds like. Now, you'll notice that this snare, like all sounds, exists in 3 different domains. So there's frequency, volume, and time. And so time is kind of the easiest one for us to see because in Ableton, it's left to right. So our snare from left to right exists for this period of time. Now, volume is also easy for us to see because it's the vertical shape of the waveform. We can see that it's quite loud at the start. It maybe dips a little bit, comes back up a little bit, and then tapers off nicely. So that's volume over time. And the frequency content of the snare is maybe a little harder for some people to see. From the waveform, you can kind of see that there's some high frequency content here and some high frequency content here. And in the middle, there's a held tonal element. If we look at it on an EQ, we can see it a little bit differently. So you can see there's a strong tonal element and then there's a whole bunch of noise. And over time, it goes from tonal to less tonal. But that's our 3 domains we need to be thinking about this sound in. Most sounds exist in those 3 domains, to be honest. What we're going to do is we're going to slice this up because this is Anatomy Park. So we'll take that first little chunk and we'll take this part. Now this last part, I'll call the tail. This middle bit, I would call the body. And this bit right at the start, I would call the transient. And I'm going to duplicate these off to the side and we're going to separate out the components so we can play them individually. So remembering our 3 different domains, we're going to play the transient and we're going to try and describe it. So it's very short in the time domain, it's very high pitched in the frequency domain, and it's very loud in the volume domain. So it's probably the loudest part of the snare. We're going to try and describe the characteristics of the body next. So here comes the body. In terms of frequency content, it has a strong fundamental note, which we can see in the EQ. It also has a little bit of noise over it. Now, in terms of time, it's short, but it's not as short as the transient. If we actually select it, Live will tell us that its duration is 44 millisecond versus the transient, which is 9 millisecond. And in terms of volume, it's almost as loud as the transient. Now, if we move on to the tail, we can see that the frequency content is much higher pitched. It's less tonal, so it's more noisy. The volume of it decays over time. The volume of it overall is definitely lower than the rest of the sound. So if we wanted to create a similar snare to this, we would need to concentrate on a very short high energy transient, a fixed pitch body, which is a little bit longer than a transient, but not as long as a tail. And we would want to concentrate on a noise element, which decays over time. So keeping that in mind, we're going to create a Serum patch, which has the basic anatomy of that. So let's pop open Serum. So we're going to use 1 oscillator to start with, and we're going to make it a sine wave. So I use this table editor to do that. And if I push a key now, we just get a sine wave. So I'm going to put an EQ on here so we can see what pitch we're playing with. So that's an F, and it's around 300 hertz, 350 hertz. Why not? Maybe we'll go to a C. We're at 260 hertz. So we'll use C for now. Now, obviously that's a sustained note. So over time, it is doing the wrong thing. So let's put an LFO in envelope mode on the level of our oscillator. That's short, but it's probably not short enough to be the body. That feels nice and snappy. All right, so that's our amplitude envelope for our snare body. So to make the transient, we're going to cheat a little bit and we're going to use the body with a pitch bend as the transient. So we're going to make this quite a short envelope and we're going to map it to the coarse tuning of our body element. And we're going to up the coarse tuning amount all the way. And then in the matrix, we're just going to click the type so that it only goes upwards. Now we can adjust this envelope and probably make it even faster. You can hear the little zappy noise at the start. That's what we're aiming to change to our transient. You can hear that's still too long. There's a nice little click there. Might be able to bring it down further. There we go. So with no envelope depth or no modulation amount, it's pretty boring. And as we wind this up, you get a tappier transient. There we go, that's got a nice click to it. Okay, so now this is our pitch envelope and that's our amplitude envelope. So for LFO 3, we're going to focus on building the tail. So we're going to use noise. We're going to bring the level of the noise down and we're going to put this LFO on the level of the noise oscillator. And we're going to put it in envelope mode. In here now we've got some noise. It doesn't sound like it's part of the sound because it's moving too slowly. We'll just edit the envelope until it becomes part of the sound. I think that sounds pretty reasonable. So that's the basics, but it still doesn't sound like a snare because it's not refined enough. We need to take this a few steps further. You can see in the EQ, we've kind of got all the components, but it still doesn't sound quite right. So let's post-process a lot of this. Now for this in Serum, I like to use a high-pass filter and I put it on the noise element only. Give it some drive. So by changing this cutoff position, you can get quite different tones out of the noise. So I like it about there. We're going to add some more effects now to really flatten this out a bit. So let's go with some tube distortion. Now let's make things a little bit quieter. We'll use a compressor to bring the levels back up. Quite like that. So if we want to make the start of this even snappier, we can use some extra distortion and another envelope to really make it pop at the very start. So we'll grab LFO 4 and we'll put it on the drive amount for the distortion. And we'll put it to envelope mode and we'll bring it all the way back to be quite a short little envelope. So now the very start of our sound is heavily distorted and then the rest continues less distorted. We'll bring that in and be a little bit tighter. Bring down the distortion amount a little. So I quite like how that's going. I might bring the overall drive down and just bring up the modulation amount. Cool. So we're getting a pretty nice sound out of this. Now there's all these other effects in Serum and you can keep using those and stacking different things on here to get slightly different sounds. What I do is I tend to bounce a sample out of Serum at this point and then move on to post-processing it. So what we'll do is we'll take a few different snare examples out of this. So I'll set up another channel for resampling and we'll take this snare that we just worked on and then we'll make some variations to that. Okay, so that's 4 different snares that we bounced out. So here they are back to back. So let's post-process these. One of the key things that I do when I'm trying to post-process a snare is to not really touch the transient too much. I might shape the entirety of the drum, but I want to leave that transient as pure as it can be because I've already gone to the effort of making sure that it pops nicely. So it's really handy to use a Transient Shaper to just affect the sustain portion of the drum. So I've made a Transient Shaper out of some gates. We've just got the tail coming through here now. So we can group this. We can make this just tail. And then we can swap these around. So this is just the transient. Now we can apply reverb. And maybe another overdrive. And see, they're just being applied on the tail. So the transient itself is still nice and clear. I can bring that decay time down a bit. So far our post-processing has gone from this to this, which is sounding a lot more acoustic and real. Now we can keep stacking distortions and reverbs and interesting effects on the tail of this. Now we could also use Corpus and its bright snare preset, which basically produces a snare all in one hit. So we'll use the Transient Shaper again to take off the attack. So that's given us a nice, more realistic kind of membrane-y feel. So you can balance the tone of all of these, and you can EQ them separately. And so because we've added tails to this, one thing that we should really do is kind of transient shape this all over again. I'll bring the sustain down a little. We've also lost some volume, so let's bring in the saturator and we'll just push it up a bit so that it's about the same volume. So we've gone from this to this. So that's a pretty nice snare. It hasn't taken us too long to make it. So we'll resample. And you can see that the anatomy of our snare is pretty spot on compared to the example that we had before. So we've got a nice sharp transient at the start, we've got a nice consistent body level here, and then we've got a nice long tail which tapers out over time. Of course, once you've built a snare effect rack once or twice, you can save those to process future snares. So if I take our snare that we just processed and I put it into this other rack where I built some snares earlier, so that's it being processed another way. This is a second and a third and a fourth. So these 4 channels here are different channels where I was affecting snares earlier. So they've got slightly different effects on each of them. And I'll just play the outcome of dropping our new snare onto these old channels. So by post-processing your snares, you can get a very different sound out of each of them. Okay, so if we have a look at the post-processing on each of these channels, I'll give you a quick run-through of some ideas. Okay, so as you can hear, this is a really distorted variation on the snare. So let's have a quick look at these effects. So we've got a Transient Shaper, which appears to be doing nothing. So let's turn it off. We've got an effect rack with a dry channel and an erosion and a pedal, which is really distorting things. So I'll turn off all the remainder of the effects. Without the erosion and the pedal, it sounds like this. And with it sounds like this. Very distorted and, very crunchy. Then we've got a new effect rack here where we've got a dry chain. And we've got a channel with the corpus, which is disabled, and an overdrive with a narrow filter and an EQ just leading through the tops. And then we've got another overdrive, which is just overdriving the top of the sound. And a saturator, which is pushing the levels up again before it hits the remaining transient shapers. So it's quite a distorted sound we get out of that. So without all that processing, and with, there's quite a different tone. Now this second processing channel, it's got a fair few effects on here. I'll turn them all off and we'll step through them one at a time. So we've got a dry channel in this rack. And so without the effects, it sounds like this. And with this first overdrive rack, where we've got 3 overdrives and an EQ only affecting the sustain portion of the sound. So without and with. So it really muffles things. And then this next rack, we've got a dry channel and then a reverb only affecting the sustain portion of the sound. Then we've got a Transient Shaper, which is bring down the sustain volume a little. Got an EQ, which is notching out a frequency. So it's just ducking out the frequencies, probably because of the distortion of the transient. Taking out a little bit of that region. And then we've got a Transient Shaper, which is just scrapping the sustain portion of the sound entirely, and a saturator, which is slamming the levels back up to 0 dB. Now you can hear there's still a little sound. If I was going to use this snare in something, I would bounce it to audio and then crop the tail off that. So this third channel, with all the effects, it sounds like this. And without the effects, it sounds like this. So let's go through these one by one. So we've got a dry chain, and then we've got a wet chain with a vocoder in noise mode, where the formants are pushed down a little bit. And the release is quite long. Then there's a low overdrive with a bit of a filter on it, and we're taking out the initial transient of the sound. So we just got that nice afterwards. Then we've got a Transient Shaper where we're reducing the overall sustain volume. And we've got an overdrive on that to really bring out the top end, and a saturator to bring the levels back up. And this fourth chain, so it's our regular snare still with this first rack switched on. We can hear corpus, giving it some nice metallic texture. We've got a Transient Shaper scraping off the additional tail. And you see the speed is all the way up, so it's quite a slow gate. We've got another effect rack where we've got a dry channel and a reverb, which is only affecting the sustain portion of the sound. And it's quite a short decay time, fully wet. And then we've got a frequency shifter in ring mode. If we bring up the mix a bit so you can hear that, hear how it's making the sound really gritty. Okay, I'll bring it back down to around 7%. And a frequency shifter, which is pushing this up by about 50 hertz. And giving it an interesting character while it's at it. And then a saturator just to push the levels back up. So that's quite an interesting processing rack. So that's an example of how extreme you can take your post-processing of snares. So the last thing that I need to show is how to build that Transient Shaper. So we'll jump onto this channel down the bottom. Okay, so we've dropped a gate onto this snare. And what we want to do is just modify these settings. We want the threshold all the way down, the return all the way down, and we want the attack all the way up. And you can hear how that's sliced off the transient already. So that's good enough. Let's call that sustain. And we'll duplicate this rack, and we'll just hit that flip button. We'll turn sustain off. And you can hear that we're letting through most of the snare. If we bring the attack down a fair bit, you can hear we're letting through just the transient. So we can call this one attack. Now, if we group both of these, we can map the attack for both of these to the same knob, which I like to call speed, but you can leave it as attack. And then we want to just drag one of these into another channel. So I'll drag sustain into a new chain and name that chain sustain. And I'll name the original chain attack. And I'll just make sure to turn on the sustain gate. And at the moment, this rack does nothing because it lets through the attack and the sustain. But we can map these volume controls to macro knobs. And so we can name this this second macro knob attack volume, and this third macro sustain volume. And if we put the speed anywhere between 50 and 100 millisecond, that usually works out okay. So the attack volume, if we bring that all the way down, now we just get the sustain. And if we bring the sustain volume all the way down, we just get the attack. So we've essentially built a Transient Shaper out of two gates. And you can vary how quickly or slowly it takes effect with this speed parameter. If we bring the sustain down, and I'll bring the speed all the way down, we get almost none of the sound through. And at 20 millisecond, we get just the very transient of the sound. So there you go. That's how to build a Transient Shaper out of some gates in Ableton. So essentially there, within Serum itself, we've created quite a synthetic snare, paying attention to the time, volume, and frequency components of the snare. And then we've used further effect processing. Now you can be really creative with these effect racks. Use distortions, use modulation effects, use strange EQs, throw filters on things. Go nuts. Just try and preserve the initial transient of your sound, and then bring the levels of everything to some sort of transient body, tail format. This will help make sure that your snare is easy to work with in future projects. You can do that with transient shaping, or you can do that with actual volume automation or envelopes, whatever is going to work for that particular case. All right, and so that was making snares in Serum. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you got a lot out of it. I hope you hit the like button. I hope you subscribe. I hope you join my Discord. And yeah, if you want any of those patches or presets, then I hope you join my Patreon to get hold of them. And I hope that you're making some really crazy snares, and I look forward to hearing them.